So this right here is my Winsor Newton watercolor paints that I have taken from the tube and put it inside this palette that I got off of Amazon. I have a tapping cloth right here. It's always good to have one. That way you don't have excess water on your page. I also have my 2 water cups right here. One I use for cool paints and one I use for my warmer paint colors. I also have right here my dryer. I like to use this to speed up the process between layers. These are the brushes that I use. These are the silver black velvet. I have size 12, 4, and 8, and these are the round tip brushes. I'm using this painting as an example. I always like to have painter's tape on hand. I like to paint down my paintings. It's easier to one, film, and to also just keep everything from moving around and it getting a little messy. It also helps to protect your desk, which you'll see mine is very worn, so it definitely does help with that. So inside my palette, I started off by mixing yellow and red with a ton of water, which is called a wash, inside of my palette, so that way when I apply it on my paper, as you see here, it's nice and light and airy and transparent. You can still see a lot of the white paper shining through. So I'm mixing that on the very top of my pie. That way it looks as though the light is hitting it, so this will be my lightest point of my pie. So I'm going to use that wet on wet technique, which is when I apply wet paint onto a surface that's already wet. So I'm using that shadow color right there towards the crust, and then I just tapped a napkin and I'm absorbing and lifting up some of that color at the very tip there. That way I just have a little bit more of a highlight on my pie. So I'm mixing up a little bit of brown with just a hair of black for my crust color, and I'm using quite a bit of water here. So I'm finding it's just too dark, so I just dipped my brush into some water, tapped a napkin, and I'm just spreading out the color that I have down right here. Again, just going to pull that all the way around the bottom and fill out that crust area. Using that same lifting technique that I just did for the top of the pie, I'm going to use again here for the crust. I'm going to get rid of everything on my brush. I'm going to lift and absorb some of that color. That way I just have some nice highlights inside of that crust here as well. So if you have a hairdryer or one of these nifty little dryers, now is the time to pull it out so that way we can move on to the other part of painting. What happens if you don't let this fully dry is those colors that we're about to put on next will just start doing that wet on wet technique and blending into each other, which is what we don't want. We want to have some clear defined lines between the crust and the pie, so we want to make sure that's completely dry. So picking up that same brownish blackish color, we're going to apply it to the very top of our crust. So now you will see that you have separate layers. There's no blending of the colors. The orange is not coming into the brown, which is exactly what we're looking for. I still want a nice highlight for the top of my crust. So again, I'm just getting a nice clean brush. I'm tapping my napkin and I'm absorbing, scooping, lifting up for a highlight at the top of my crust. Now this technique will only work, I like to call it the scooping technique, if your painting is still wet. If your painting is dry, you will not be able to lift the color, so just make sure you're taking that time to just lift up the highlight as you go. So into the original pie color that I used, I am just adding a little bit more darkness, a little bit of red and a little bit of black into that, and I'm applying it right here. So you'll see I find it a little bit too dark and hard to push. I'm just going to dip my brush into some water, and I'm not going to dip my brush back into the palette. I'm just using the paint that I have down on the page to just spread that out. Again, using the wet on wet technique, I'm coming in with darker shades and I'm tapping it into that side of the pie just so I can have some nice shadows and contrast within my painting. Another technique that we're about to see is called the wet on dry technique, and this is when you apply wet paint onto a dry surface. So I'm going to use that technique at the very top of my pie using the crust darker color that we have, and you'll see there's no spreading or blending of the colors. It's just sitting on top and I have a harsh line. So I don't like painting with harsh lines, so you'll see I just tapped my brush into water, and I'm going to continually tap my brush and having clean water and tapping my napkin, and I'm spreading it out until I don't have that harsh line, kind of that gradient of color here where it goes from dark to light, so that way I have some nice blends. And I'm going to make sure that's 100% dry before I move on to the next step. And you'll see here I'm just mixing up again some of the crust darker shades. So the color I put down I find is just too dark, so using some water, I'm just going to be dragging out that color that I just put down, making sure it's nice and light. And I'm just going to be hitting the edges so that I have some shadow. And I'm coming in between the pie, and I'm not covering absolutely everything. You'll see I'm missing some spots. I'm going to the top of the pie as well, and I'm just doing like little details just to give that nice definition and pop with my pie crust. So this is what you would call your second layer when you've already got all of your base colors down, and now you're just coming in and you're detailing. So this is up to personal preference, and it can actually be kind of difficult to keep wanting to push yourself to add more details. So at this point, play around, put some shadows down. As you'll see, I'm continually going in, touching up my edges. I'm adding more shadows. Have fun with this. Make sure that you're blending out your colors so you just don't have harsh lines everywhere. But practice doing 2 layers, and then when you feel comfortable, make everything dry. Do a 3rd layer if you would like. But I'm going to stop here with the 2 layers because I'm pretty happy with this for being a beginner's tutorial. I hope that you have learned some new tips along the way. I look forward to painting with you again. Feel free to check out my YouTube with the other paintings that I have ready for you.